This is Mr. Gideon. So now we're going to talk about international trade. And it's a good time to do so right after we've talked about growth, the importance of long-run growth for countries across the globe, but also one of the factors that most economists believe will contribute to growth, and that is free trade. So we're going to dive into that with a little more detail here, but frankly a lot of it's review. If you think back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about opportunity cost, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, specialization in trade with regards to individuals. We alluded to the same concept being applied to countries, but we really only delved on an individual basis. And you might remember Tom and Hank, the two castaways on separate islands that have different comparative advantages, who ultimately figure out that it's possible where they could specialize in the production of one thing and then trade some of that away to the other guy and have both of them better off. Well, it's the same concept essentially. So we're going to review a few terms here and apply it to countries. First of all, remember comparative advantage is also stated as lower marginal opportunity cost. Sometimes people focus, most of the time actually, they focus on production costs, and so you might also hear it phrased as lower marginal opportunity production cost, but it's all comparative advantage. Remember also that comparative advantage and absolute advantage are similar, but they're two different things, and we have examples here. One of the two countries will never have a comparative advantage when you're doing a comparison between two countries in the production of both items. But it's possible for one country, when you're comparing two, to have an absolute advantage in both. The example that we have on this page is not one of those kinds of examples, but that's one of a few differences between absolute and comparative advantage. But just like individuals, two countries, in this example we have Canada and the United States, can achieve mutual gains from trade if they understand on some level what their comparative advantage is. So you see here examples for Canada on the right hand side of a straight line production possibilities frontier. We also refer to this as a production possibilities curve. I call them PP curves for short. And if Canada's got two choices, once again, this is a theory, this is a model that is an oversimplification. No country would ever have a choice of just producing aircraft or pork, but in this example, that's what we have. And they put all of their resources towards producing aircraft. Then, according to the numbers in this example, they could produce 3,000 units of aircraft. That's going all the way to one extreme. If you compare that to the United States, straight line production possibilities frontier, the United States, if they put all their resources towards the production of aircraft, could pump out 1,500 units. If we go to the other extremes, when it comes to pork, don't ask me why pork finds its way as an important thing, a resource in this example that each country is choosing how much to produce of. But if we go to that extreme, 1.5 million tons of pork that Canada can produce if they put all of their resources in that direction, and they end up on the far extreme down here of this PP curve. For the United States, it would be 3 million tons of pork. In this example, of course, if you were just going to be asking yourself who has the absolute advantage in terms of each of these items, we've already said 3,000 for Canada, and then in this example 3 million tons of pork is the absolute advantage compared to 1.5 for Canada, so the United States wins out there. But that's not really what we care about. We don't care very much about absolute advantage. We care about comparative advantage. Don't be tempted to try to take a shortcut and say, well, you know, at least I know from what I've learned before about comparative advantage that one country's going to win in one thing and the other one's going to win in the other, and so I'll look here without doing my calculations like I can figure out who's going to win where. You don't know until you set up your ratios and reduce. So don't try to take a shortcut. And also keep in mind that gains for individuals or countries don't depend on each country's being better at producing one kind of good. Even if one country has a higher output per person hour in both industries, an absolute advantage, there could still be mutual gains from trade. Most of the time, essentially what we're saying here is that we compare the output of a good but it might be a different kind of opportunity cost that's represented using this model. Might have to do with output per person hour. And it's a different kind of example, but in either case, comparative advantage is what we're interested in. A couple of other terms you just want to review here. You've had these before. Periods relevant to trade. Remember we discussed potential using PP curves at a point in time, and so that's really key, especially if you think back to the recent lesson about growth over time. The potential of economies can expand if they make the right decisions about how to go about doing that, and pushing the envelope, or perhaps even expanding from a relatively inefficient level. But the period of time is really important concept for this. Before a trade is made, we're talking about the ex ante position. After the trade is made, we're talking about the ex post position. Trade and terms of trade are also really important. Terms of trade, once two individuals or two countries come together and say, all right, I'll trade X amount of this for X amount of what you've got, are the terms of trade. Now, up until this point, what you've had to do is look at some numbers, maybe throw out some numbers, and by trial and error say, yeah, this would be acceptable terms of trade for both countries. Looking above in the example on this page, let's say you said, okay, so the United States could specialize in the production of quantity of pork because based on my calculations, which I'm not going to show you here, but you should recall how to do, they have this comparative advantage in pork, and they're going to specialize in that. Canada's going to specialize in the production of aircraft, and they're going to trade away some. They will hopefully be better off. What about 1,500 for a quantity of 2 million tons of pork? Will they end up being better off or not? And you kind of see where they could have been if they had not specialized and traded, if they had just remained somewhere at some point along this PP curve, each one of them, and you compare those numbers to the proposed trade, and that's your style of trying to figure out whether it's acceptable terms of trade for both countries. But you don't have to do that anymore, because at this point I can share with you a shortcut for determining the acceptable terms of trade, and I'll just call it my own rule of thumb for the terms of trade. Well, how do you do this? Step one is you set up ratios for each country or individual, if you had two people that you were going to do the same kind of calculation for, and those people or countries need to have straight line PP curves. Once you have the ratios set up for each country, then you set the same side of each equation to 1, and finally pick a number between the numbers on the other side of the equation for both countries, and if that number is in between the other two numbers, they're both going to be better off. If it's not, it's outside the range of numbers on the other side of the equation for both of them, then one country will be better off and the other one won't. The best way to help you understand this is to just show you how to do it. And so, same exact diagram up here, I've just shrunk it down to try to save us some space, and I can show you what I mean. So we'll set up the ratios, that's step one. And so of course on the left hand side you have the US, and you ask yourself, well, what's their ratio? We go to the extremes, and instead of aircraft and pork, I'm going to abbreviate here, and I'm going to say A and P. So the United States has 1,500 A to 3P is their initial ratio. For Canada, it becomes 3,000 A to 1.5P. Now, step 2 says, set the same side of each ratio, each equation, not really an equation, it's a ratio, to 1. It doesn't matter which side you want to set. Let's say that you feel more comfortable setting the left side equal to 1. Fine. You should know how to do that. You've done this in basic math as a function in probably more than one class. So you have to divide both sides by the number you want to reduce to get to 1. So on this side, of this ratio, you're going to divide by 1,500, but you're also going to do it on the right-hand side. Over here, you got to divide both sides by 3,000. Once you do that, you can see what one aircraft, one airplane, is worth to the United States. Becomes worth 1 over 500p. Over here for Canada, 3,000 cancels out in the numerator denominator, and you get 1 to 1 2,000th p. And if the two countries say, all right, we're going to specialize in trade, we're going to propose terms of trade of one aircraft to a certain number of tons of pork, and that second number is in between these two numbers, then they're acceptable terms of trade. Now, you're obviously looking at this and probably going, oh my gosh, what number is between 1/500th and 1/2000th? If you can figure that out, great. But for most of us, average minds like myself, we might say, that's a little awkward, so I'd rather set the right side of these ratios to 1. And you can do that as well. So if you said, okay, I'm going to divide both sides by 3 for the US and both sides by 1.5 for Canada, and then look to the left side of the ratio, you could do that as well. Either way, it's up to you. If we're just taking a peek at this and we say, all right, so I'm going to divide both sides by 3 on the US production possibilities frontier, so that 1p equals 500 on the left hand side, 500 aircraft. That's more digestible for me, so I'll write that. And for Canada, I'm going to divide both sides by 1.5, so that now, just like with the United States, the right side is set to 1. The left side will become 2000A. That's easier for me to say, okay, I can visualize right now that if the two countries were going to propose a trade, according to this theory, let's say it was 1 million tons of pork for 600 units of airplanes, that would be acceptable terms of trade because 600 is in between 500 and 2,000. Done. Or let's say that the proposal was for every 1 million tons of pork, we're going to trade 1,520 airplanes. That's still in this range between 2,000 and 500 on the left side for the US. Fine, still acceptable terms of trade, and if you plotted that point out and did the trial and error method that you did earlier in the semester, you would see that it works. As a matter of fact, you might be expected to do that and go beyond this rule of thumb in an example for our class. You've done that before, you can do it again. One more example. Let's say that the terms of trade that were proposed were for every 1 million ton of pork that gets traded to one side, the other side trades 200 units of airplanes. Well, 200, of course, is outside of this range between 500 and 2,000. That would not be acceptable terms of trade for both countries. One country would end up being much better off than before the trade, but the other country is going to end up worse off than if they had just said, you know what, we're going to do our own thing, we're going to produce airplanes and pork all by ourselves, and we're not going to trade with this other country. Now, this sounds really good, and of course trade is widespread across the globe. But how do countries know when they have a comparative advantage? Well, the first thing you need to know is that government officials are not sitting in some office plotting PP curves or calculating opportunity costs. And all this work that we've done before is based on a model to emphasize the idea that trade can make two countries or two individuals better off than if they didn't have trade. But the reality is that these numbers aren't being calculated somewhere and used to make decisions with regards to whether or not to trade with the different trading partners that countries consider trading with. It's actually individuals' desire to earn a dollar, a peso, a euro, whatever currency matters to them, that determines the pattern of international trade. So if you drill down to a kind of a micro level, the reality with trade between countries is that you have a collection of hundreds and thousands and perhaps millions of individuals across the globe making decisions on a daily basis about whether or not to trade, and it resembles more of this kind of story that we have on this page. For example, Teresa. This is a real person. If you've seen Black Gold, the documentary that premiered at the 2006 Sundance Film Festival that I've showed periodically in some of my classes, you know that the main character there is Teresa Mesquela. He's a person who has organized a huge cooperative. As a matter of fact, it's a cooperative union, so it's a collection of cooperatives that is responsible for more than 1 million Ethiopians who are coffee farmers. And in the film, he's the central figure who is shown traveling all over the globe trying to find good markets for their coffee. But let's just keep it really simple and say, Teresa, this one person, only worrying about his own self-interests, is somebody who sells coffee from his country, Ethiopia, which has a comparative advantage in coffee production like other coffee-producing countries. The reality is that it's very difficult for a country like the United States, who has a ton of coffee consumption on a daily basis, and a ton of coffee drinkers, to produce their own coffee, because typically the best coffee, the highest quality coffee, can be produced best at high elevations and at a latitude that's around the equator. So that's why countries like Ethiopia, Peru, Indonesia, and these regions are known for their quality coffee, because they have large, high mountain ranges typically, or high plateaus in these countries, and they have the warm tropical climate that comes with being located around the equator. It gives them an advantage, a comparative advantage. It's not that you can't produce coffee anywhere in the United States. It's not that it's impossible, but you would really have to go above and beyond the natural level of resources that these other countries have that easily at their disposal to produce coffee. They have a comparative advantage. So you have Teresa from one of these countries, Ethiopia, who, with his profits from selling coffee, buys something that he needs, like insulin. He's become a good friend of mine over the last several years. Once we contacted him because of the film, introduced ourselves, and had him come to Chaminade. And long story short, now his daughter has graduated from Chaminade. She graduated in the spring of 2011. And what I've seen when he's come is that he, as a diabetic, needs to have his insulin with him, and he sometimes takes advantage of the opportunity to be in the United States to find cheaper sources of medicine that he needs, because that's something we have a comparative advantage in. So if Teresa was not only in the coffee business, but he was also an importer and exporter by trade. This is all he did, forgive the pun, but he was a trader, not just a buyer of the products that he needs, whether it's for him or maybe people in his cooperative, and not just a seller of coffee, but like a full-time exporter and importer of all kinds of things. He'd be searching the world for countries with a comparative advantage in order to buy low, and then he would sell his inventory of whatever he bought to people in countries with a comparative disadvantage and a need for those products he's purchased, selling high. Teresa's actions, along with others like him, move each country toward acceptable terms of trade. In this example, the U.S. ends up importing coffee from Ethiopia, which is relatively cheap for them to produce, and exporting insulin and other drugs to Ethiopia, because for us it's relatively cheap compared to the cost it would take for Ethiopians to produce certain kinds of drugs on their own. Now use this following link to see recent import and export numbers for the U.S. Make sure you click on Exhibits 3 and 4 to see exports and imports of services. We talk a lot about goods or products in this class, but you don't want to neglect the services because there's a lot of money attached to that. Then click on Exhibits 7 and 8 to see exports and imports of the goods and products. Take note of where pharmaceutical preparations, or drugs like the ones we've discussed, seem to rank compared to other exports. You might find that interesting. You might also find where oil ranks as you scan through these numbers.